Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Melinda Haring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Today's panel discussion is called "Where is Unrest Taking Us in Kazakhstan?" We have four fantastic experts to discuss that question in great detail. This event is co-sponsored with our friends at the Onyx Society, and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Edward Lemon to give framing remarks. Before I do, I'd like to welcome my four distinguished panelists. I have Dr. Ariel Cohen, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I have Ambassador Bill Courtney, an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan. I have Dr. Nargiz Kasanova, a senior fellow at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. We're happy to have you, Nargiz. And finally, the lovely Dr. Jennifer Brick Murtazashvili, an associate professor and director of the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. We are so lucky to have you. Thank you so much for getting up early for us. Edward, over to you. Help us understand these protests developed last weekend. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what to watch for and how we should be looking at this conflict. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us for this very important event. We've seen protests in the west of the country starting right after New Year's, rapidly spread across Kazakhstan. The protests began as a result of rising energy prices, but rapidly took on a different form. And they really reflect anger at misrule, at a corrupt government that has been very authoritarian, at social inequality. And ultimately, we've seen events in the past few days in Kazakhstan that are unprecedented. We've seen the former president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, resign from his position as head of the Security Council. We've seen the entire cabinet being removed from their position. We've seen statues of the former President Nazarbayev toppling, and we've seen a great degree of violence in the country, which really started with the government using suppressive tactics against the protesters. We've seen the president frame protesters as terrorists and ordering a shoot-to-kill policy by the police. And we've seen the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a Russian-led defense bloc, intervening in the country at the invitation of President Tokayev. I think although the protests have taken and the events have taken this geopolitical time, I think it's important to remember that these protests began as a reflection of the grievances that are being felt by many of the Kazakh people and the anger that they have at decades of misrule. I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds. I think we need to also keep in the back of our minds that this is also a humanitarian tragedy that's unfolding on the ground. So we're seeing dozens, if not hundreds of people killed. The precise figures are unclear because we still have an internet blackout in the country and it's very difficult to get precise information. We've seen many hundreds injured and many millions of people living in fear given the violent events that are unfolding. But I think it's very important that we have this discussion and the panelists can delve into many of these different issues. And I'll turn it back to you, Melinda, and over to them to hear their comments on developments on the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you, Edward. You managed to squeeze in all the important points in 1 minute, so well done. So if you haven't joined us before, we have 60 minutes and we're going to have a conversation. I invite you to send in questions if you're in Zoom or to send us questions on Twitter. And I'll be glad to pose those at particular people if you tell me who to direct the question to. So without further ado, Nargiz, what is the scene like in Almaty, the biggest city in Kazakhstan, which has been the center of the protests? How many people are coming out? What are they doing? What are they demanding? And how is the government responding? If you could just set the scene for us and bring us up to speed, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Melinda. It's great to be with you and this great panel. This week is probably the darkest hour, the darkest week in the history of the country. Not a long history, but nevertheless. And the Almaty, the city of Almaty looks quite dystopian. So it has been violated, right? Big time. The buildings are, had been put on fire, and the shops robbed, and there is a smell of smoke, and there are still some occasional shootings that residents hear. There are also reports of peaceful residents of Almaty, marauding shops. So it's really heartbreaking to see what has happened to the city. And Ed talked about the protests, and indeed protests are a very important part of the story. But now there is this second big story unfolding. Indeed, we do have protesters with the demands of reforms and more democracy, fair elections, and in addition to more social economic justice. Like, it all started indeed with the spike in gas prices that affected particularly strongly Western Kazakhstan. But in addition to that, very different group of people whom I really insist we shouldn't call protesters. Yeah, we should call them rioters. Yeah, they entered the picture. And who are these people? Who mobilized these people? And who has sort of orchestrated these actions? Of course, that's the biggest question at the moment. And of course, there are speculations, and it seems the consensus is that these are people linked to the family of the first president, and these are so-called sportsmen criminal groups, and maybe with an addition of some Salafi, Wahhabi groups. So we will see. I hope there will be an investigation, and I do hope that the representatives of the public will be also part of the investigation. So it's not behind closed doors, and the society sees all the evidence. So we will see what's going to happen. But I think it's very important to note that we shouldn't call all these people, protesters. Definitely, kind of what started with as a normal protest then was diluted by people from, whom we never saw at any protests in the cities before. Definitely, they don't care about, kind of making demands and so on. They were interested in upsetting the order, in destruction, in marauding, and so on.
Got it. Thank you so much, Nargis. That's really helpful. Jen, I'd like to turn to you. So some analysts say that the protests really aren't about fuel hikes at all. Is the real issue about Tokayev pushing back against Nazarbayev? Is that the way to understand this unrest?
I think it is really too early to say exactly. I think these are sort of internal sort of Kremlinology dynamics that I'm really hesitant to speculate upon. Maybe some of our colleagues who have better information about this would be willing to engage that. But I think that we have to look at this as these fuel protests as a trigger to a much larger event. These fuel protests and sporadic protests have been going on in Kazakhstan for some time. Especially since Tokayev came to power in 2019, we've seen protests really sweeping the country, especially during the election, the so-called election when he came to power. We saw civil society mobilized. And it's really important to remember that this comes on the heels of the 10-year anniversary of the massacre in Western Kazakhstan, where more than a dozen oil workers died. And so, of course, that this painful increase in gas prices really triggered a lot of indignation about the past history of the country and violence that people had seen against the government. So these protests really started at the local level. And I think that's a really important dimension that we should all consider, is that they were localized. Different protesters in different parts of the country had different grievances focused on local governance issues in those countries. Tokayev had promised local governance reform. He had promised this. He had talked about it. He had laid it out. He had made speeches about it. And he had never delivered upon those things to people. So when many of the protesters came together, they coalesced around the promises that Tokayev himself had made. And I think a lot of us are wondering why he didn't step forth and make good on many of those promises that he had told people, the things that he was going to do. And that actually leads us, Melinda, to your question about what is really going on here, because he seemed to actually have the answer to many of those questions, that he himself had laid out the solutions to many of the things that the protesters were demanding, except for sort of the larger economic redistributive questions, that deal with corruption and so forth. Those were really the most significant issues. But how this is playing inside, I'd be curious to hear what Ambassador Courtney has to say about that and sort of the intrigue at the higher levels.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Absolutely. I'm going to go to Ariel and then bring in Bill. Ariel, so Nargis and Ed both said the big news is about the Csto, the Russian-led military alliance that's been deployed to Kazakhstan. How many troops have been deployed and what message does this send? Most analysts think this is a really big deal. Please explain why.
Good morning and thank you for having me. I've been going to Kazakhstan since 1993. I've written 2 books and 5 reports about it, and I was caught unprepared, and I'm afraid that a lot of people in Kazakhstan all the way up to the top were caught unprepared as well. Csto intervention invited by President Tokayev is a pivotal point in the balance of power in Eurasia. We did not see Csto troops deployed by invitation before. The Kyrgyz uprising, I believe in 2010, they asked and Csto refused to intervene. Apparently the Chinese and the Uzbeks were against. This is a big deal. I've seen numbers from 3,500 to 5,000 troops. That is not enough if they are engaged in fighting. So far, the messages are that they will be protecting key facilities like the Baikonur spaceport, like the Sari Shagan space weapon station that is run by Russia, and maybe some areas in Almaty. But the official line is that they do not fight. Another important issue is that now Armenians, Belarusians, Tajiks, and big question mark Kyrgyz are going to be working with the Russians in Kazakhstan. President Tokayev today said that this is a short term, but Sergei Mironov, the head of the Just Russia party, and other top Russian politicians already called for permanent deployment of these troops. And if that happens, that changes the balance of power, as I said. Another important thing is, and I know you're going to ask me that, is whether the Chinese are on board. We saw the statement of President Xi Jinping saying that they're against colored revolutions and they support peace. Of course, they support peace. They have $26 billion oil and other investments in Kazakhstan. However, I hear from my sources that there's a strong message to the Russians to limit the scope of this intervention by Chinese, and that may create a friction point between Russia and China. Chinese hold a lot of cards in Central Asia, including a better relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They can create a lot of troubles from Russia, for example, on the Afghan-Tajik border. So I would say that today and the next several days are crucial in how fast the authorities of Kazakhstan can put down this insurrection. I think what's important for our audience to understand that there are 3 components. As the colleague said, the general socioeconomic protest that started with liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, that people use for cars, some people use for heating their houses, but this was essentially a socioeconomic protest. People literally said, we want bigger salaries, and lower prices, and it was peaceful. And President Tokayev was the old President Tokayev. He said, sure, we're listening. We have the government commission meeting on Monday. That did not stop it. Criminalized elements, people who were looting, joined in. And potentially, we need to check that further. The Islamists, I saw videos of large outside prayer meetings during the protest. I never saw outside street prayers in Kazakhstan. One of my sources is telling me some of these people were fighting in Iraq and Syria, came back surreptitiously, created these terror cells, and now we saw the violence. We saw horrible violence against law enforcement, against civilians, against shops, police precincts, KNB headquarters in Almaty. A lot of things burned down, unprecedented violence. And honestly, no country can tolerate that. And this is why we see the harsh response and insufficient response, I would say, by the Kazakhstani law enforcement in the first days of the riots that caused President Tokayev to call President Putin. And now we saw him today thanking Putin for a quick intervention.
Thanks, Ariel. A lot of great points to pull on there. And I think it's important to say that we don't know. Nargis described the chaos and the thugs and the violence. And there's a lot of
it's
really
literally
scary
fog of war, as much sources in Russian Twitter and Russian internet and people in Kazakhstan I was calling and I was getting in touch on secure apps quite a lot. But fog of war, literally.
Yep, for sure. Ambassador Courtney, so I've got a lot of questions for you, and I think our audience will too, but could you explain why did Tokayev have to call in the Csto to bring order? Is it right to say that the security services and the military were loyal to Nazarbayev and not Tokayev? Is that the right way to understand why he made that decision?
The power structure, the Nazarbayev power structure or power elite in Kazakhstan has been calling the shots all along. Tokayev is a career diplomat. I've known for 30 years, so wonderful person, but he has no independent power base in Kazakhstan. He's not able to supervise the security forces. So they are loyal to the Nazarbayev power elite. For Tokayev to call in, was again probably a decision of the Nazarbayev power elite to call in the Russians. They are probably concerned about the loyalty of security forces. There were reports that some security forces in the west of Kazakhstan went over to the side of the protesters. So just as Lukashenko in Belarus sought support from Russia, partly to ensure the loyalty of his own security forces, Tokayev, Nazarbayev power structure appeared to have done the same in Kazakhstan. But as has been mentioned, the Russian forces will likely not be involved in shooting. That would be very unpopular in Russia and would outrage Kazakhstan as if the Russian forces shot Kazakhstani people. A concern that we should watch out for with Russian forces is if they congregate in the northern oblasts that have larger minorities of ethnic Russians. The ultranationalists in Russia have called for those oblasts to be brought into Russia. This could be an opening for Russia to have some forces in those countries. That's one reason why most Kazakhs will be really disappointed, if not angry, at the decision by the power structure to bring in Russians.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador Courtney. Nargis, you wrote about this decision on Twitter quite passionately as well. And you said, so right now, and I know it's early days, as a result of calling in these troops, it looks like Moscow may come out on top. Right now, the situation is moving in a direction where Moscow will have a weak guy in charge who owes them big time. Is that the right way? Is that a correct summary of the situation as it looks now, or do you disagree?
Well, yes. As Ambassador Courtney mentioned, the citizens of Kazakhstan are very concerned. The first reaction was to the decision to call the Csto troops was highly negative, and people were, they felt that the sovereignty of the country is sort of, given away, because that sort of signals that Kazakhstan cannot take care of itself, and obviously the kind of reference to the external terrorist attack, it's so it didn't make much sense, because we do see that it's kind of these are our people doing things on the ground, and the dynamics is internal, but of course with the big involvement of Russia, in a sense that Russia is this big actor and guarantor and provider of security and personal security, interest group security, and so on and so forth. So there was the people felt shocked and disappointed, but now the kind of there are some arguments that it was a necessary decision. There was no other choice for President Tokayev kind of to survive and to go through this period. As Ambassador Courtney mentioned, he doesn't have his own power base. So we'll see. As there is a fog of fog of war at the moment, but definitely I still think that it was a pretty horrible decision, and I think it damages the legitimacy of Tokayev internally, and it damages the reputation of Kazakhstan internationally.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Nargis.
Because we are sort of repositioning, since we're repositioning ourselves.
For sure. Thank you. Jen, I want to come back to you on this question about the foreign-trained terrorists. So Tokayev has blamed foreign-trained terrorist gangs for the violent protests, but he hasn't really supplied any evidence that I've seen. Maybe you've seen some. Could you respond to that claim? What do you make of it?
I think that's nonsense. We don't know very much, as Nargis said, that there's a fog of war going on. But I think one of the reasons I'm keen to dismiss this as an explanation is because it's the same explanation that we see immediately following every single source of unrest, and we never see good evidence of it. So this explanation, I really want to, make sure that our listeners understand that there is no evidence that I've seen. We saw a Russian lawmaker call Daesh and, the Gulen movement. I thought, well, is he going to call the Haqqani network next? I mean, this is ridiculous to see these names being thrown out like this. And then the size of the conspiracy was vast, right? He talked about, and this is what didn't make sense about Tokayev's speech. He said, 20,000 people in this huge, vast conspiracy across the entire country, terrorists, Kazakhstan has a very significant police state, significant security apparatus. For an operation to go unchecked like that, 20,000 people, that's really well coordinated and quite unprecedented. What we saw was quite unprecedented, and I think it's going to take us a while to understand it. We may never know, right, the source of the unrest in Almaty. We do understand the source of the unrest in the provinces, but what we saw play out in Almaty was something very different. And I saw a commentator, I can't remember who, I want to make sure I give due credit, this morning, it said that there's two conflicts going on inside of Kazakhstan right now. There's a conflict between the people and the citizens and the government at the local level, and that is a distinct conflict that we're seeing play out among the elites. And what that conflict looks like among the elites is something that we don't know enough about. Ambassador Courtney's hinted at this. Nargis, you've talked about this tension and Tokayev not being a very strong player in all of this. And so he doesn't have a very strong power base. How long he will stick around, this has really undermined his legitimacy. And I think what this does tell us is that he does not trust his security forces. If he did, he wouldn't have called in Russia. I mean, I think that's the only logical explanation that we can think, unless there's a larger foreign plot behind that. But I'm really hesitant to see that, because what he's done is he's given so much, as Nargis has mentioned, he's given up so much of what Kazakhstan has stood for. It's multi-vectored foreign policy. It's relatively liberal, and I want to use the term relative liberally here, position in the region, its economic position, its human rights position. vis-a-vis other countries, which was a bit more promising. And I don't want to put any rosy colored lenses on that, but if you compare it to Russia, if you compare it to Uzbekistan, there were more freedoms there. And it's given up all of that, which has allowed the country to have a higher GDP than its neighbors, has allowed the government to have a social contract that others didn't have. So there's a lot of questions I think we have right now.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Some important points. Bill, what price do you expect Moscow to extract for sending the troops in and hopefully bringing order to Kazakhstan?
I don't think Moscow is in a position to extract much of a price. The most important thing for Russia is that Kazakhstan, which has maintained good relations with Russia for 30 years, which the West has encouraged for Russia, for those kinds of friendly relations to continue. All of the transportation routes in and out of Kazakhstan, for example, go through Russia, rail and road transportation. There's no situation comparable to Ukraine, which is trying to break away from Russia's influence. Kazakhstan is not trying to do that. It wants to cooperate with Russia, but it also wants to maintain its sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity.
Great, thanks a lot. I want to go back to Jen. Can we dig in a little bit more on the legitimate protest movement that you and Nargis have described? Is there a leader of these movements? Because there's protests all over the country. And if not, is there coordination between the protests across the country? What can you say about that?
I mean, so far as we know, the answer is no. But it seemed that there was a leader. This seems to be quite an acephalous, headless movement. But there were different political parties, different political movements, whose rhetoric was being used by the different movements. And towards the end, before the crackdown, we saw protesters come up with lists of demands. And we can't say that these lists of demands represent all of the protesters, because so much of it was so localized. You were seeing different demands coming from different communities across the country. And that's where my biggest source of concern right now comes from what President Tokayev said, right? He said he's going to shoot to kill anybody who stands in his way. And then he's calling these protesters terrorists. Well, these protesters, and he says, the fact that people from the outside were calling me to negotiate with these people, this is ridiculous. I mean, but many of the things that he has been talking himself about were the same issues that these protesters were raising. So to distance himself from that is really an about face for him. And that not only is it bringing in the Russians and the Csto that undermines his legitimacy, it's what he has said to people over the years. And that, I think, is a big concern. And not only for Kazakhstan, we could talk a little bit later about how other leaders in the region are sort of repeating that mistake, I think.
Thanks, Jen. Ariel, what's the likely outcome? Will Tokayev have to resign, or do you think he'll manage to stay in power?
No, I think it's, why would Tokayev resign when he will say that he did not have control over law enforcement, or law enforcement did not perform? He said they're going to investigate the performance of security services and law enforcement. You saw that some key people in the KNB, in the security services, were already replaced. The head, Karim Masimov, was replaced. The nephew of President Nazarbayev was replaced, and one other people, they were replaced with people close to President Tokayev. But I want to make another point. Why we see such ferocious reaction to this protest? I agree with colleagues that there are elements that were organized and violent. We need to investigate. The Kazakhs need to investigate, but we need to keep good track of what exactly happened. And Jen, I think sooner or later we will know who these people in Almaty were. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that the 30 years of independence created a generation or a generation plus of people who do not have the historic memory of how things were under the Soviet rule, when there was scarcity of food, where people had no agency, when the nuclear testing was going on in Semipalatinsk and Semey, when before that Kazakhs were starved in a genocidal fashion, and a third of their population was starved by communists, and hundreds of thousands, if not more, people were brought as Stalin's exiles or gulag inmates to Kazakhstan. Once these people grew up, they had a whole different perception of reality. Their demands were driven by the fact that this is a upper mid-income country. It wasn't about getting food on the table. It was about getting bigger and better things in terms of their lives, and the social inequality in Kazakhstan, and hence the protest about it. I don't want to call it social envy, but social inequality was a huge driving force. And President Tokayev talks about it. He said that needs to be addressed. He probably is going to say he did not have the power until now, but this violence also puts a big question mark on attractiveness of Kazakhstan, on image of Kazakhstan. What Jen just said, it was a more liberal authoritarian model, and people invested over $300 billion since independence. US is still the number one investor because of the oil, gas, and minerals sector. The Chinese are close second, and year by year in the last 10 years, Chinese led in the investment. So restoring the policy, the image, the openness, and moving beyond this, addressing the social issues that these horrible violence and protests exposed, will be job one for Tokayev or whoever else is going to be there.
Okay, thanks, Ariel. So Ariel says no. He says Tokayev is going to stay. Yep, got it. Jen, Nargis, Bill, any disagreements?
I think
ahead,
it
Jen.
went.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bill. You were fast.
Okay. Depending on how the politics of this work out, whether the Nazarbayev power elite, some of them are likely already fleeing the country, but whether they remain in power or not, whoever has real power, Tokayev will be swept away as soon as someone has real power and asserts that power.
Great, thank you. Jen or Nargis, any other thoughts on this question? No?
We don't know. Oh, Nargis, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the same thing. We don't know, I also have a sense that he's more of the transition figure, but for how long, I don't know. Because now there is such a chaos and confusion, I think at all levels. So we will see. But at the moment, I think he does have a reform agenda. Yeah. We'll see how it will unfold. Today, he made an address to the nation, and there are some worrying statements in it. And I think one maybe I can mention here because it's linked to what we've been discussing. I don't think he's kind of really lumping the protesters. I think there is an understanding that these are different people, but he refers to the so-called, and that's how he's phrasing it, the so-called human rights defenders and activists who, place themselves above the law, and, they think they can gather wherever they want. And because of the irresponsible actions of these gory activists in Russian, so of these activists, the police, the law enforcement bodies cannot really focus on what really matters, and basically they are distracted by them. And because of these activists, the internet has to be narrowed, as he mentions, and that affects the interest of the millions of people. So I think that this is a very, very worrying rhetoric.
Yeah, for sure.
And in his speech, he also came down against the media, right? He blamed the media, he blamed human rights activists, he blamed civil society, and then he lumped them in together with Islamic extremists. And that, to me, was like the classic playbook, right? That is not new. And so that's why it's really hard to take. It could be any of these things, right? But we don't know, because when you lump everything together like that, it really becomes uncertain. But one of the reasons I'm more convinced that his time, I hate to prognosticate, is short-lived, is because he has undermined his own legitimacy by doing this. He has shown that he himself is weak, unless there's an external third party that's going to continue supporting him. But that third party, like Russia, has to have a reason to support him versus someone else. If you look at his background, he's a technocrat, right? He's reform oriented. What incentive, and now, that basis of his power, that sort of technocratic aspect of everything that he stood for is sort of gone, right? Sort of, it's no longer there. So what does he have? And I'm not sure he has a strong power base. I'm not sure he has charisma. I'm not sure he has the kind of legitimacy that you need to hold this thing together.
Great, thank you.
Especially when there's an outside power, standing there.
For sure. Let's broaden this conversation. So we've looked at the internal dynamic in Kazakhstan. Ambassador Courtney, next week is a big week for the United States and for Russia. We have big talks scheduled. How does the situation in Kazakhstan impact Russia's force posture on Ukraine's borders? Russia has about 100,000 troops poised on the outside of Ukraine. What does this mean for that conflict? Are the two related?
It may not have any impact on Russia's force posture opposite Ukraine. Russia has enough forces elsewhere, and indeed the small amount of forces that it is sending to Kazakhstan are easily taken from central Russia and other areas. Some of those forces going into Kazakhstan were ones that Russia sent into Crimea in 2014. So some of them are special forces. The Kazakhstan situation, in some sense, complicates Russia's situation with regard to the West on Ukraine, because now you have Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan all posing varying kinds of threats to future influence of Russia in the post-Soviet space. I imagine that the talks, the US-Russian talks, will be broadened in Geneva to include something about Kazakhstan, but maybe not a lot, because there's not a lot of actionable activity for the United States, or really for Russia, in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's developments are going to depend almost wholly on what happens inside Kazakhstan.
Okay, let me ask it a slightly different way, so we get a different answer. So some analysts are saying that the unrest in Kazakhstan will distract the Russians, and that they won't be able to act as quickly in Ukraine if they wanted to. That Ukraine may have a little bit more time. What do you think of that argument?
I don't think it's possible really to assess that. Russia has all the forces it needs with regard to Ukraine. Russia has developed a very strong propagandistic political message on Ukraine. The West is not likely to make the immediate concessions that the Russians are demanding. So that crisis may build pretty much on its own. What happens in Belarus, what happens in Kazakhstan may not have much impact on that.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Ariel, question for you. You've already answered my Beijing question. How does Beijing view this? Thanks for doing that. But say a little bit more about what you're seeing in the Russian press. Were they caught off guard? How do they view this instability, and how are they feeling today?
What is creepy about this is that senior Russian politicians, including Vyacheslav Nikonov, Molotov's grandson, who plays a significant foreign policy wonk role. I was with Slava on many TV, clashes and whatnot, and others have been pinging Kazakhstan in a pretty nasty way in the Russian media for the last 3 years, I want to say, about the language rights of the Russian minority. They're obsessed with that. 30 years after the independence, you would think that a country that is 70% or 65% Kazakh, I think it's close to 70% by now, Kazakh has a right to have their language that was brutally suppressed under the Soviets as the state language. Now I saw Margarita Simonyan, the head of Russia Today, tweeting that Russia should provide support to Tokayev only if he agrees to bring in Russian as the state language, second state language in Kazakhstan, and give up the Latin alphabet transition that President Nazarbayev and President Tokayev very slowly and carefully tried to shepherd in to follow other Turkic-speaking countries in the former Soviet Union, starting with Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and others. So that's issue number one. Issue number two, they're saying, yay, the empire. We're getting the empire. Kazakhstan is going to be in the Russian Empire. And this is obsession. I just published yesterday a piece in The Hill saying that Russia is refighting 500 years of its imperial wars. The thing with Ukraine and Belarus and the pressure against the Baltic states reminds me, or can be compared with, the Livonian Wars of Ivan the Terrible in the second part of the 16th century, the Baltic Wars of Peter the Great, the Ukrainian expansion of Catherine the Great, etc., etc., etc. So the mission civilisatrice, quote unquote, of the Russian imperial tradition is playing out in front of our eyes. And the worst case scenario is Zhirinovsky and others, who, by the way, was born in Kazakhstan. Zhirinovsky and others are calling for, one, leaving these troops on a permanent basis in Kazakhstan, and two, dismemberment and having northern Kazakhstan that is majority Russian population, creating a Donetsk, Lugansk type of scenario, and then integrating it into Mother Russia. The ideological underpinnings of that are in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous piece called How to Rearrange or Reorder Russia, Как нам обустроить Россию, from the 90s. So I'm worried about it. I'll be honest with you. I've written a book about Russian imperialism. So it's front and center in the way I am looking at that. Whether they surprised? No, because their knee-jerk reaction to any kind of popular demands, protests, or revolutions is smash it. We saw it in Belarus, and now we're seeing it in Kazakhstan.
Super. Thank you, Ariel. Okay, my friends, it is now time for Blitz Round. I have, I think, 28 questions. I have 4 wonderful experts, and I'm going to aim a question at you. Please limit yourself to 2 or 3 sentences. And if you don't, I'm going to give you the marker. Okay, first for Bill. I think I know the answer. I think I know your answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What's the possibility of a Crimea-style referendum happening in northern Kazakhstan should the protests continue?
In Crimea, the ethnic Russians had a majority. They do not have a majority in northern Kazakhstan. So if Russia wants to carry out some mechanism to annex it, they'll have to use some force.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, George Kroll had a note. He says, how do the panelists assess the absence of Nazarbayev from the scene, including his leaving the chairmanship of the National Security Council? Is this a transfer of power? Nargis, do you want to take that?
Yes, I think it's the second half of the political transition, basically. Now it seems complete, what started in 2019. But can I take up this one
Please.
Also on northern Kazakhstan?
Please.
I don't think Russia needs it. I think it's more it's better for them to keep it as a leverage, sort of constantly hanging there. But at the same time, it's much better to have the whole Kazakhstan on board and to integrate this region at an extremely high cost.
Thanks a lot. Jen, question for you from Rob O'Donovan. Good morning, Rob. Are there domestic opposition groups looking to take advantage of the grassroots protests over the LPG price hikes? There are several wealthy Kazakh businessmen in exile who may see an opportunity to unseat the current elites. Your thoughts, Jen?
Sure, there are groups that exist, but they're quite nascent. They don't have strong organizational capacity inside the country. There's some grassroots civil society movements, but they really don't exist much outside of the cities. So I think this is not consolidated by any stretch of the imagination. Not much there.
Super.
That's the consequence of authoritarianism.
Thank you. Bill, question for you from Voice of America's Russia service. What interest do the United States have in Kazakhstan in the conditions of the deployment of Russia and the Csto troops? How can the United States protect these interests and protect international business in Kazakhstan?
So the main interests that the United States have in Kazakhstan are a peaceful return to a stable, more open, more pluralistic system that will reflect the interests of all Kazakhstanis to a greater extent than the autocratic system now. The second main interest is that Russia not perceive opportunity for imperialistic adventures, if you will, as Dr. Cohen was pointing out, for Russia to perceive that Belarus or Ukraine or Kazakhstan would be a free opportunity to use force or intimidation anytime it wants to. That would be very unstable.
Super. Ariel, can you say more about how these events will impact Russian-Chinese relations? Just to summarize it for us.
Well, first of all, the outstanding feature of the Russian-Chinese interaction here is opacity. Whatever is said behind closed doors and possibly encrypted bilateral communication. But we've seen that Russia and China are already stepping on each other's feet in Africa. Russia and China initially had a very different approach to Afghanistan, to the Taliban. China was much more engaged through the Pakistanis with the Taliban than Russia. But also Russia is, if you wish, burdened with its Tajik ally that it has to defend and provide security assistance. The 201st base in Tajikistan is there. It's a brigade, 5,000 people. And the Chinese are already having a small base in Tajikistan. The Chinese are not happy with how Russia blocked some of the routes of Belt and Road transportation arteries, including through Kazakhstan. So the more China is involved, and the Chinese involvement now is slowing down in Central Asia because of the economic crisis in China. But the more China is involved, the more the two great powers are going to step on each other's feet. Although China was happy that Russia was paying for security, I always joke that China outsourced the security to the Russians while they were making money. The question is, in this current unrest, can China proceed making money? And I see different reports. Some factories and oil production are saying there's some strikes. Others saying we're continuing to produce. That has to be drilled down and followed very, very carefully.
Definitely. Jen, jump in, please.
So, I mean, this sort of division of labor that Russia does security and China is doing big infrastructure in Central Asia seemed pretty stable. And it gave Central Asian countries a great deal of autonomy as they engaged with Russia and China in recent years. And I think one of the misconceptions that we have is that, Central Asian countries are just these pawns of great powers. What we've seen over the past several years is these Central Asian countries really sort of embrace this rivalry, take advantage of it. And so what's surprising me really about China's critique of Russia here is it is disrupting that traditional balance, that the security issues, because you understand we haven't mentioned the Uyghur question at all. We haven't talked about the Uyghur population inside of Kazakhstan and China's attitude towards that. So you could see on the one hand how China would say, okay, Russia is going to handle the stability. We don't want instability. stability at any cost. That's what we saw in the reaction to Afghanistan, right? We're not seeing that here. So it suggests that there's much more tension in this relationship than we thought.
Super, thank you. Bill Courtney, Pamela Spratlin says, hi, thank you for the panel. What are Tokayev's other choices given what you've all said? What should be the US response?
So the right choice earlier would have been for Tokayev to propose a broader dialogue with the peaceful protesters representatives, civil society representatives, some of the repressed political parties, all together to try to find a way forward that really opens up Kazakhstan's authoritarian rule. Otherwise, this choice is very destructive for Kazakhstan and could lead to a lot of instability for a long time.
Thanks a lot. Nargis, I know you keep trying to get away from this question, but I'm going to try again. What do you see as the most probable end game based on what we know now? And there's a fog of war. What will be the new normal for Kazakhstan?
I think we're all trying to get away.
I know. I'm trying again. I'm persistent.
Every 2 hours, there is some big piece of new information that sort of corrects what we've been thinking. No, to be honest, I don't know. Like what seems to be very clear that the Nazarbayev era is over. And now we entered this new stage in our development that our political elites couldn't manage the political transition on their own. So we failed. We failed that. We failed on clearly on many other aspects. Yes, Bill mentioned that there should have been a dialogue with the protests, but there should have been, more dialogue with society overall and more channels. And I think there was quite a few chances missed, like the 2021 parliamentary elections. Probably they couldn't have experimented with the presidential elections in 2019, but the parliamentary elections gave them a chance, to let some opposition parties, that are sort of embryonic at the moment, to enter politics and to make parliament not this place of responsible people. Now the parliament members say that we're not responsible for what's happening in the country. It's not our fault, but it is their fault. It's the blame is on all of us to this or that extent.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bill, back to you. Michael wants to know, this is a second question about the US policy response. He says that it's hard to come up with something on the fly, but he wants to know, should the US condemn the deployment of the Csto? Should they condemn the violence? Should they condemn the crackdown? Should they condemn the lack of democracy?
Events are moving quickly in Kazakhstan, so the US needs to be careful about what it says. But for example, the German Foreign Ministry has taken a more forthright position in condemning violence than the Department of State has. My guess is the Department of State probably needs to move and probably will move more toward criticizing the deployment of Russian forces, CSTO forces, and violence by the regime.
Why has the U.S. State Department been, I would describe the response as weak yesterday. The response was about 3 or 4 sentences. Are we trying to keep all of our options open for Geneva next week? Is that a cynical way of reading the statement?
The issue is not Geneva. I'll make a comparison with Belarus. Our responses to Lukashenko's crackdown have been much harsher, lots of people sanctioned, for example. But we've had 30 years of really good relations with Kazakhstan, with the Nazarbayev government, which has made an enormous number of positive steps in the international community, from non-proliferation to hosting the Syria talks, chairing the OSCE, for example. So our relationship with Kazakhstan has a lot more political capital in it.
Okay.
We will want to try to manage that carefully.
Okay, that makes sense. Jen, did you have any comment on the statement that came out from the State Department yesterday?
Both sides. I mean, it was. I thought it was actually quite weak, but I think this is. I mean, as Ambassador Courtney said, that the U.S. has a lot at stake there. But on the other hand, I think it also speaks to a larger question of U.S. strategy towards the region, and that's something we haven't spoken about. And it's really unclear. With the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, with these events, I think the U.S. should take a very careful look at its strategy towards Central Asia. There have been strategy documents that don't say a lot, and maybe the U.S. doesn't have incredible interests in this region. That's a legitimate question we can be asking, but I think it's really time to revisit that strategy.
I think that's a good discussion for our next panel. Another question for Bill. This is a great question from Tom. He says, how can the Nazarbayev era be over when the whole elite is still Nazarbayev and Tokayev doesn't have a base of his own?
So it's not clear that the Nazarbayev era is over in the sense of the power elite or the power structure that supported Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev himself and some of the close family people their era may be gone. For example, several of Nazarbayev's daughters are billionaires in their own right. A new government, even if it supports the same kind of power structure as Nazarbayev, they're probably not going to look with favor on that. So I think we'll see that the Nazarbayev family transition in some ways, but the power structure itself may remain for some time.
Okay, thanks a lot. Miriam Lanskoy has a number of comments that are really interesting. So if you have a chance, go to the Q&A, and she says, I'm not going to read all of them, but she says, this is a succession struggle. Many are calling this a Tokayev coup against Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev was removed, and she's pointing out that Nazarbayev's stronghold is in Almaty. Her comments are definitely worth having a look at. I want to, Nargis, you got one, go ahead, and then I'm going to go to Jen with the last question. Go ahead, Nargis.
Yes. No, it's just that on Nazarbayev era, I think that Nazarbayev was the core of this system. So now that he's gone, I think the kind of this era is over. And of course, the kind of the system is still the same. And we're not talking about the revolution. It's transition, political transition from one set of actors to.
If I may add a finger here on this.
Hold on, let her finish.
And can we make one more question, one more statement? I think the Belarus and Kazakhstan is a very different situations. Yes, there was state violence against protesters, right? And that's we saw it on a regular basis. It's not something new. But then there was a kind of there were Belarusian protests were not done by thugs, right? Although that's what Lukashenko claims. But here we do have these thugs that kind of descended on the cities.
Thank you, Nargis. Go ahead, Ariel.
There's a tremendous fallout to all of the post-Soviet space, including Russia, of what happened. And what happened is that a leader in power, like Putin, for example, will think twice and three times before picking and appointing anointed successor in the Mexican style. You remember the old PRI, the sitting president will pick up his successor. That, I think, is part of history now. People will be very careful to stay in power, to cling to power, regardless of age, health, and their situation, because they cannot trust anybody.
That's a great point. John Roberts says, Bill Courtney, fascinating comment about U.S. policy, but he says it's still surprising that the U.S. has so little attention for a country with massive oil and gas investments and a country that produces 40% of world uranium. That's definitely a good point, John. Last question from Azima. And Jen, we have 1 minute. What implications do the protests have for other post-Soviet countries such as Kyrgyzstan and their states of democracy? How would you compare the protests to the October 2020 protests in Kyrgyzstan?
A lot of similarities to Kyrgyzstan 2020, sort of the same protest dynamic about some legitimate concerns. Kyrgyzstan was about, fraud in the parliament. And then you saw these same sort of thugs come out. as Nargiz described them. You saw, and they sort of took over what was happening. And the question I think many of us are asking about Kyrgyzstan, asking about Kazakhstan is, who are these people? Where did they come from? I don't believe it's the Haqqani network. I don't believe it's the Gulen movement. I think something else is going on that, Ambassador Courtney hinted at. We don't know, but I think it does not speak well for civil society in the region. One thing to keep our eye on is this makes Uzbekistan, I think, a really important player, maybe the regional hegemon, something we should be looking out for.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you so much, Bill Courtney, Dr. Brick Murtazashvili, Dr. Ariel Cohen, and Dr. Nargiz Kasanova. We learned a ton today. You guys were fabulous. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to need to do this again. The situation is far from resolved. Thank you for spending your Friday morning with us. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.